Welcome to Let's Talk Automotive, and in this week's episode on how things work, we are going to be having a look at disc brakes. So, we know that most passenger car vehicles these days have, at least on their front brakes, a set of disc brakes. We know we've got some drums on the rear, but we're going to talk to drum brakes on another program. So what are the basic components of our disc brakes? Well, obviously we have our brake pads. Our brake pads are housed in a brake caliper, and then we have our brake disc itself. So let's start off with the brake pads themselves. The brake pads technology has come on in leaps and bounds. In the old days, the compounds that we used to manufacture the braking surface area used to be made out of asbestos. Now obviously those days are gone, we're not allowed to use asbestos anymore. So designers had to come up with better friction materials to cope with the high demands of braking. And when I talk about high demands of braking, you must understand that all the kinetic energy that exists in your vehicle when it's moving is dissipated in the form of heat through your brake pads and brake discs. So these two put up with an enormous amount of stress and heat. So the materials are critical. So we get three basic types of materials that we use on our brake pads. The first is an organic compound. And by the way, that organic compound explains why if you've been braking heavily, you can sometimes smell the brakes and it smells terrible. And that's actually the decaying organic material that's decaying as a result of the heat. The second type that you get is based predominantly on a metallic compound of materials. And the different metals that we use, including copper, give the brake pads some nice characteristics. Now, there's always advantages and disadvantages for either, so most of the brake pads that we see these days actually have a compound of the two. So we have organic material, some carbon, and some metallic materials in here, and that gives us some nice all-round characteristics, including the brakes being nice and quiet, the ability to stop a vehicle quickly, as well as some longevity. Now the second major component is obviously the disc itself, or the rotor as it's technically known as. Now this can be made up of any number of different materials. Obviously on passenger cars the majority of discs are manufactured out of cast iron, and I'm going to talk to some of the effects that that has on us. But we can also have these made out of ceramic. So some of our hypercars initially came out with ceramic brakes because they can put up with a lot of heat and stress. And then we see a lot of our supercars come out with carbon ceramic brakes, which have a few better qualities, including being able to brake instantly without having to heat up first. And then on some race cars, including Formula One cars, we see full carbon brakes. Let's get back to the discs that we see on our passenger cars, which are predominantly made out of cast iron. Now, one of the things that we often pick up on brake discs is the concept of brake shudder. And a lot of people think that the brake shudder is due to the fact that the disc itself has warped. Now, unfortunately, that's not the case, because cast iron physically cannot warp. It is either straight or it's going to break, one of the two. So what causes brake shudder? Well, very simply, what we find with brake shudder is that we've had uneven wear along the surface area of the disc. Now what causes that? Well, when we've been braking excessively and we've built up a lot of heat in the brakes, what we often do is we get to a stop street or a robot and we keep our foot on the brake. Now, as I said to you, all the energy, all the kinetic energy is being dissipated in the form of heat. So there's a huge heat buildup that exists now between the brake pad and the disc. And if we've kept our foot on the brake, we're creating a nice heat sink over here. And this then gives the opportunity for the disc to soften at that point. And so we get uneven wear throughout the disc, as I've said. And that uneven wear doesn't have to be a lot for brake shudder to occur. In fact, anything more than 0.07 of a millimeter difference in the height of the disc from a thickness point of view will in fact cause brake shudder. So to prevent that, all we've got to do is make sure that if we have been braking hard, that we do give the brakes opportunity to cool down by simply coming off the brakes or just braking softly for the last half a kilometer or so of driving. But if you don't have opportunity to do that, then when you do get to the stop street and you're stopping, take your foot off the brake and then put on your handbrake which activates the rear brakes. And of course, the rear brakes don't have anywhere near the amount of heat buildup that we find on our discs in the front. Now, another thing that we do find with disc brakes is that the brakes tend to squeal sometimes. Now, what causes brake squeal? Well, there's two major causes of brake squeal. The first is that we need to understand that when a brake pad is activating up against a disc, it vibrates all the time. It's just that most times that vibration and the harmonics that it creates is out of our earshot. We don't hear it. The cats and dogs might hear it, but luckily we don't. But there are a few circumstances that can occur that cause the harmonics to now come within our ear range, and we hear that in the form of a squeal. So what can we do about that? Well, depending on what's caused it, if we first have a look at maybe the dust buildup that's occurred in our caliper, remember that our caliper is also a free-floating device and moves around a bit. So if we've got dust that's built up, whether it's brake dust or dust from the road and dirt from the road, that can change the harmonics of the vibration or the frequency of the vibration on the pad, which then brings it into earshot. The second thing that can cause brake squeal is if the brake pad itself has got so hot that the bonding agent starts to discharge and it causes the disc to get a bit of a glazing effect, and that changes the frequency of vibration. And so the way to get rid of that is to perhaps give the disc a light skimming. The other thing that we can do, obviously, is to make sure that we fit the brake pads correctly first time. Now, you'll see on this brake pad over here, it's got a nice spring that locks the pad into place. And a good technician, what they will generally do is also pack some copper slip or copper grease on the back of the brake pad itself. So when it seats up against the caliper wall, it also makes sure that the pad doesn't unnecessarily vibrate. One of the things that you would have noticed on this disc is the fact that it's actually made up of two rotors, and in between this disc over here you can see these vents and these vanes, and this is in fact how we cool a disc. So the air is going to come in through here, there's going to be a heat transfer, and it's going to be expelled out with the movement of the disc itself. A lot of people confuse the cross drilling that we sometimes see on a disc, or the slots that we see, as being the thing that cools the discs. But actually, that's not what those are for. So you would have noticed that our cross-drilled or slotted discs are predominantly seen on high-performance vehicles. And what that does for us is that, as I've already said, when the brake pad gets incredibly hot, there is a gaseous discharge that occurs. And what happens is that rapidly expanding gas actually parts the disc and the pad away from each other. So no matter how hard you brake, there's very little contact that's taking place. And that gives us an effect that we know as brake fade, where there's very little braking. Now with the cross-drilled or the slots, that gas is allowed to escape and therefore causes the brake pad and the disc to now seat again and returns our braking to normal. So a lot of questions we get include, why are the calipers and the brake pads positioned in certain areas on certain vehicles? Now this is a very interesting topic, and there are a number of design reasons why we would place the caliper in different positions on the disc. I'm just going to talk to the main one in my view, and that is all to do with the auto binding effect that we get out of our caliper because it is a floating caliper. Now, I want to take you back to your school days when you rode a bicycle, and you would have noticed that the front brakes on your bicycle were positioned in front of the forks of the bicycle, because you know that if you had put them behind the forks, what would have happened is those brakes would have locked and you would have been over the handlebars acting as Superman quite quickly. Now, it's exactly the same effect when it comes to our brake caliper position. So on 99% of rear-wheel drive vehicles, if we have a look at the front brakes, which is where all the braking action takes place, you will notice that in fact the caliper and the pads are situated behind the center of rotation. And that's because when we brake, the brake pads and the caliper are going to lock into position and auto bind, which means we now can have a smaller brake pad and a smaller brake caliper, which means I've now got less weight on the front wheels which aids the handling of the vehicle. Now, unfortunately, it's very difficult to achieve that effect on a front-wheel drive vehicle for the simple reason that in addition to a drive shaft, I've also got a steering arm to consider. And that steering arm is normally behind the center of rotation, which means that I've got to position my caliper in the front. So quite a few interesting things to consider in terms of our brakes. They're a very, very important safety feature on our car. And once again, our suggestion to the viewers out there is don't compromise when it comes to the quality of the items that you use to repair your braking system. So that's it on our disc brakes, on how things work, and we look forward to seeing you next week.